She called it charming. She meant it as an insult. 6 weeks later, she was on her knees in that same garage, asking the man she'd mocked to save her company from a lawsuit that could end it. That's not the twist. That's just where this starts. Because the real reason her company was about to burn down had nothing to do with bad luck and everything to do with a decision she made 9 years before she ever set foot in that garage. A decision she didn't even know she'd made until a mechanic in a stained canvas coat said one sentence that put the floor out from under her. Stick around, because the part that comes at the 4-minute mark is the part people replay. The tow truck driver couldn't stop laughing either. He hauled the CEO's stalled SUV 11 miles off the interstate, past 2 chain repair shops with heated waiting rooms and glowing signs, and dropped it instead at a cinder block building with one bay, a hand-painted sign, and a dog asleep in the doorway. Vivian Thorne stepped out in a cream coat that cost more than the building looked worth and said, out loud, to no one in particular, "You have got to be joking." She had no idea she'd just insulted the one person in the country who could save her from what was coming. And what was coming was already moving through 11,000 vehicles, quietly, one heat cycle at a time waiting. Harbor Mills, Vermont had one stoplight and 400 people who all knew whose truck was whose. Callum Reese had grown up there, left for 11 years, and come back the week his wife's chemotherapy stopped working. Some places you run to. Harbor Mills he came back to, because it was the only place that never asked him to explain himself. He ran Reese Auto and Machine out of the same cinder block building his uncle built in 1974. One bay, a lift that groaned on cold mornings, a wood stove that did more actual heating than the furnace ever managed. His daughter, Junie, was 7, and she did her homework at a folding table pushed against the parts shelf, because the apartment upstairs got too quiet in the afternoons, and Callum liked keeping her where he could see her. Junie had her mother's habit of narrating everything out loud, and she'd absorbed 4 years of garage conversation the way other kids absorb cartoon jingles. She could diagnose a car before Callum had touched the hood. "That's the Hendrix minifan," she announced one October morning without looking up from her coloring book. "It clunks when it turns left. You said it's the sway bar link." "I said it might be," Callum corrected. "You said it's definitely the sway bar link," Junie said. "You just don't like sounding sure of yourself in front of customers." She wasn't wrong. She was almost never wrong. And that, on its own, should tell you something about how much this man actually knew. A lot more than a one-bay garage in a town most GPS systems didn't bother naming would suggest. Here's the part nobody in Harbor Mills ever talked about, because Callum never gave them a reason to. Before any of this, before the funeral, before the folding table, before the wood stove, Callum Reese spent 9 years as senior propulsion systems engineer at Aldergate Fleet Dynamics, a manufacturer that built diesel hybrid drivetrains for regional delivery and utility fleets across the Northeast. He designed the torque balancing system that became the company's signature technology. His name sat on 4 patents. None of that mattered much when his wife needed him 2 states away in a hospital bed, and his daughter needed him at the breakfast table every single morning without fail. So he walked away, quietly. No fight, no severance worth mentioning, no goodbye tour. He came home and started sweeping metal shavings off a concrete floor instead. And if that struck anyone as strange, they never said it to his face. That was the whole arrangement. It worked, right up until an SUV with an Aldergate Fleet Dynamics decal on the door broke down 11 miles outside town, and everything that had been quiet for 4 years suddenly wasn't anymore. Vivian Thorne had inherited the chief executive chair at Aldergate 2 years earlier, after her father suffered a stroke that ended his ability to run the company he'd built from a single machine shop into a 4-state operation. She was sharp, good with investors, better with spreadsheets than her father had ever pretended to be. What she hadn't inherited, not automatically anyway, was 30 years of knowing which engineers actually built the company, and which ones just showed up to meetings wearing the credit for someone else's work. She was already behind schedule, already in a mood to be unkind to whatever she saw first, when the tow truck dropped her at Reese Auto and Machine. What she saw first was a folding table with a 7-year-old's math homework on it, and a man who didn't stand up straighter or apologize for the state of the place. "This is where they towed me," she said. "Not quite a question. Nearest shop with a lift," Callum said. Give me 20 minutes. She looked around the bay the way people look at something they've already decided isn't worth their attention. Charming little operation, very rustic. She said it the way people say things they intend to be remembered, then stepped back outside to make calls in heels that were never built for gravel. Junie, from the folding table, watched her go and said, not quietly enough, "She's not going to like the bill." Now here's where most people assume the story goes. A rude customer, an underestimated mechanic, a big reveal, roll credits. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller, and it's the reason everything after it went the way it did. It took Callum 4 minutes to find the actual problem, not the alternator the dashboard warning suggested, which is what most shops would have chased first and billed a small fortune for. A wiring harness, chafed against a mounting bracket installed at a slightly wrong angle. He'd seen that exact wear pattern before. He'd flagged it in a design review 9 years earlier and been told the fix cost too much to implement mid-cycle. He fixed it in 20 minutes with parts already on his shelf and wrote an invoice for $41. Vivienne read the number twice. "That's it? That's it." What was actually wrong with it, he told her. Wiring harness. Chafe point. Known issue, flagged before, never corrected because of tooling costs. And something in the specificity of that sentence stopped her cold, because a country mechanic doesn't usually know a fleet manufacturer's internal design review history, let alone the exact conclusion it reached about a bracket angle 9 years ago. "You've worked on Aldergate vehicles before," she said. "Something like that," Callum said, and closed the hood. And that was where the conversation ended, because Junie needed her math worksheet checked, and Vivienne Thorne got back in her SUV feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't name yet. She didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. Then the email landed, and after that, she thought about almost nothing else. It came in from Aldergate's own quality assurance department on a Tuesday morning, forwarded up the chain with more alarm attached at every step. A fleet customer in Ohio had reported 3 separate vehicle fires. Same wiring harness, same mounting bracket, 3 different trucks, 3 different build years. Preliminary investigations suggested the fault wasn't isolated. It looked systemic, tied to a manufacturing tolerance that had shipped on an estimated 11,000 vehicles currently on the road across 6 states. The projected cost of the recall, her chief financial officer told her within the hour, sat somewhere between $60 and $90 million. That number didn't include litigation. It didn't include the insurance claims already stacking up from fleet operators whose trucks had caught fire in company parking lots. The engineering team she assembled that afternoon looked confident and said almost nothing useful. Most of Aldergate's senior propulsion staff had turned over in the last 5 years, chasing lower costs and faster hires, and the people now sitting at that table had inherited a drivetrain platform they hadn't designed and didn't fully understand under pressure. Their proposed fix would take 4 months to validate. 4 months the company's 2 biggest fleet contracts almost certainly would not survive. And here's the part that should have made her furious at herself, if she let it. Her father, Wallace Aldergate, 3 years removed from the stroke, slower in speech now but still sharp behind the eyes, sat quietly near the back of that meeting. He listened to 4 months of proposed testing time, and then he said one sentence that cut through the entire room. "Find Callum Reese." Nobody at that table recognized the name. Vivienne did. It took her a second to place it, and when she did, her stomach dropped in a way no spreadsheet had ever managed. Her father explained in the halting sentences the stroke had left him with exactly what that name meant. Callum Reese had designed the torque balancing system at the center of the recalled drivetrain. Callum Reese had flagged the exact chafe point now causing vehicle fires 9 years earlier in a review that got overruled on cost grounds. Callum Reese had quit without a fight the year his wife died, and nobody at Aldergate had thought to call him since. Vivienne sat very still. "I met him," she said, 3 weeks ago. "His shop is where they towed my car." Her father's expression barely moved, but something behind his eyes did. "Small world," he managed. "For a man that good. You'd think that's the moment everything turns around. It isn't, not yet. Because there was someone else in that room who did not want Callum Reese's name to ever come up again, and he moved faster than anyone realized. Aldergate's chief operating officer, A polished, well-liked executive named Preston Voss had built the original recall response plan himself, the 4-month validation timeline, the manage it quietly strategy. The talking points that described the fires as isolated incidents under review. What none of that paperwork mentioned was an email Voss had sent 2 years earlier when an early field report first flagged heat cycle wear on that exact bracket. He'd routed it to a junior analyst with a note reading, essentially, "Let's not open this can of worms before the Meridian contract renewal closes." The Meridian contract closed. The can of worms stayed shut. And Preston Voss's annual bonus, tied directly to fleet retention numbers, had cleared without a hitch 2 years running. If Callum Reese walked back into this the way Wallace wanted, he wouldn't just find a chafed wire. He'd find the paper trail showing exactly how long Aldergate had known, and exactly who'd decided silence was cheaper than honesty. Voss didn't know any of that consciously as he sat in that meeting. All he knew was that a name from 9 years ago had just been spoken out loud in front of the board, and that the last time anyone at Aldergate had listened closely to Callum Reese, it had cost the company nothing but a few $1,000s in tooling changes it never made. He had no intention of watching that mistake get corrected on his watch, in public, with his own signature sitting 2 years deep in a file he'd hoped nobody would ever open again. He waited until the meeting broke, then made a call from his office with the door closed to a man Vivian had never met and never would have approved of. None of that was Vivian's problem yet. Her problem was smaller and more immediate. She still had to drive back up to Harbor Mills alone and ask a man she'd mocked to his face to fix a disaster her own company had let fester for 9 years. And she had no idea yet whether he'd say yes. He was under a truck when she arrived. Junie was at the folding table again. The wood stove was working exactly as hard as it had been 3 weeks earlier. "I need to talk to you about Aldergate," Vivian said, standing in the same doorway. Except this time, she didn't look at the room like it was beneath her. Callum rolled out slowly. "I don't work there anymore." "I know. I read your personnel file this morning. I know what you designed. I know what you flagged in 2016 and what got overruled." She let that sit a second. "I know 11,000 trucks are on the road right now with the exact failure you warned them about." Something moved behind his eyes, quiet, controlled. The stillness of a man who trained himself years ago not to react visibly to things that used to make him furious. 3 fires so far? 3 that we know of. There'll be more before the weather turns cold enough for people to leave those engines idling in enclosed loading docks," Callum said, flat, like he was reading off a part number. "Chafe point gets worse with vibration cycling and heat. Cold weather makes people leave trucks running longer indoors. You've got a window before this gets a lot worse than 3 fires." Vivienne felt the floor shift under that sentence. The competence of it, delivered without a shred of drama, by a man in a stained canvas coat in a one-bay garage that most people would have driven right past. "I need you to fix it," she said. "Whatever that costs. Whatever you want. I need the actual fix. Not 4 months of consultants rediscovering what you already knew 9 years ago." Callum looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at Junie, who had stopped coloring and was watching the whole exchange with the frank, unblinking attention of a kid who understood more of adult conversations than adults like to admit. "I have a shop to run," he said, "and a kid to raise. I'm not driving 4 hours to sit in her conference room getting talked over by people half as qualified as the last team that overruled me." "Then I'll bring the conference room here," Vivian said, and meant it in a way that surprised even her. She did exactly that, and this is where the story could have gone one of 2 ways. Either he humiliates her the way she humiliated him, or something else happens. What actually happened surprised everyone, including the 2 of them. Within a week, Aldergate's remaining senior engineers were driving to Harbor Mills twice a week, sitting on folding chairs in a one-bay garage with a wood stove and a 7-year-old's math homework pushed to one side of the workbench, taking direction from a man they'd never heard of 2 weeks earlier. Callum walked them through the real failure mode, the mounting bracket geometry, the manufacturing tolerance that had drifted just enough to matter, a fix that could be retrofitted in the field in under 2 hours per vehicle, instead of the 4-month redesign the internal team had proposed. He didn't do it for free. But the number he named surprised Vivian more for how modest it was than for anything else. He did it on one condition, that Aldergate cover the retrofit cost for every fleet customer immediately, publicly, before the lawsuits forced the issue, and that the company's engineering review process include, permanently, an outside safety reviewer with no financial stake in production deadlines. Vivian agreed before she'd even finished reading the second condition. That should have been the end of the hard part. It wasn't. 3 days into the retrofit rollout, a letter arrived at Aldergate's legal department, unsigned, claiming that Callum Reese was violating a non-compete clause buried in his old separation paperwork from 9 years earlier. A clause that, if enforced, would bar him from consulting on any Aldergate Drive train platform for a full decade. Attached was a photocopy of the original agreement, highlighted in yellow, the relevant paragraph circled twice in red ink like somebody wanted to make absolutely sure nobody could miss it. Vivian recognized the handwriting on the circle before she recognized anything else about the letter. She'd seen it on internal memos for 2 years. It belonged to Preston Voss. She could have quietly buried it. Plenty of people in her position would have. Instead, she walked it straight into his office and set it on his desk without a word, the way you set down something you already know the weight of. "You drafted the separation agreement in 2016, she said. "You'd know better than anyone whether that clause is even enforceable." Voss didn't blink. "I'm protecting the company from a conflict of interest lawsuit nobody's thought through yet." "You're protecting yourself," Vivian said, "from what happens when Callum Reese finds out you sat on a field report 2 years ago and decided it wasn't worth losing the Meridian contract over." For the first time since she'd taken the chair, she watched something crack behind a senior executive's composure, and she understood, in that moment, exactly how close her company had come to losing everything, not to a wiring fault, but to a man who'd rather let people's trucks catch fire than let a bonus slip. She had the internal legal team review the non-compete that same afternoon. It didn't hold up. Callum's separation had been voluntary, undocumented as a termination, and the clause had never been triggered because Aldergate itself never paid the severance the clause was contingent on. Voss had known that too. He'd sent the letter anyway, betting that fear alone would be enough to make Callum walk away before anyone looked closely enough to notice the timeline didn't add up. It almost worked. Callum read the letter the same evening it reached him, forwarded quietly by an assistant who thought he deserved a warning, and for about an hour, sitting at the folding table across from Junie's math homework, he considered simply stepping back and letting Aldergate solve its own mess. "You're doing the thing again," Junie said, not looking up. "What thing?" "The thing where you decide something's not worth fighting for before you even try." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. She'd said it plainly, the way she said everything without knowing quite how much weight the sentence carried. He called Vivian back that night instead of walking away, and told her he'd finish what he started, but only once the letter itself, and whoever wrote it, was accounted for in writing. It was accounted for within the week. Marion Delacroix, Aldergate's general counsel, cross-referenced the anonymous letter's internal formatting against company templates and traced it to a printer registered to Voss's own office 3 floors up, paired with the 2-year-old field report he'd buried and the retention bonus paperwork tied to his silence. The board didn't need much more convincing. Voss was placed on administrative leave within days and resigned before the review even finished. The kind of quiet ending that barely made a ripple outside the building, but changed everything inside it. Now here's the part that decided everything. The retrofit rolled out across 6 states over 5 weeks. No more fires were reported. Industry analysts had projected a $90 million recall and the loss of Aldergate's 2 biggest contracts. Instead, it closed out at just under $31 million, and every fleet operator who'd been ready to walk away stayed, because the company had moved faster and more honestly than any competitor would have in the same position. None of that made the papers with Callum's name attached. He didn't want it to. What changed was smaller, and it's the part that actually stuck. Wallace Aldergate asked to meet him once the crisis passed, in person, at the shop, because by then his health made travel difficult, and because, he told Vivian, some conversations deserved to happen on the other man's ground for once. He arrived slowly, moving with an aide's help, and Callum came out from under a different truck to shake his hand. "I should have overruled the people who overruled you," Wallace said. the words coming slower than they used to, no less clear in meaning. 9 years too late to matter to the people who got hurt. Not too late to matter to you. You didn't have to come all this way to say that, Callum said. I did, Wallace said. I built that company thinking the smartest people in it would always be sitting closest to my office. Took a stroke in 3 vehicle fires to remember that's usually not where the smart ones end up. Vivienne stood off to the side, thinking about a gravel parking lot 3 weeks earlier. About the words charming little operation. Very rustic. Leaving her own mouth before she'd bothered to look past a wood stove and a folding table to see who was actually standing in front of her. She had spent 2 years since her father's stroke trying to prove she belonged in a chair she hadn't fully earned yet, mistaking sharp edges for competence and polish for substance. It had taken a $41 invoice to show her the difference. She offered Callum a position eventually, though she was careful about how she offered it, because by then she'd learned enough not to repeat the mistake her predecessors made 9 years earlier. Not a corner office demanding relocation. Not a title that would pull him away from Harbor Mills, or away from the folding table where Junie did her homework every afternoon. An advisory engineering role, remote, structured entirely around the hours he was willing to give, with final authority on any safety-critical design review across the company's drivetrain platforms. He could keep the garage. He could keep the wood stove. He could keep every single afternoon with his daughter exactly the way it had always been. Callum thought about it for 4 days before saying yes. And even then, only on the condition that Junie could tag along to the plant twice a year, because she'd started asking, with the specific seriousness only a 7-year-old can manage, whether she could see where the trucks actually got built. She got her wish that spring. Junie walked the Aldergate assembly floor in oversized safety glasses, narrating everything the way she narrated everything else, and stopped dead at the exact mounting bracket her father had spent 2 decades thinking about, on and off, without anyone else in the building understanding why it mattered to him so much. That's the one you fixed, she announced, loud enough that 3 assembly line workers turned to look. That's the one, Callum agreed. Vivienne, walking a few steps behind, found herself smiling in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly numbers or board approval ratings. She'd learned in the space of 6 weeks that the gap between how a place looks and what it's actually capable of is usually exactly as wide as your willingness to look past the surface of it. Her father had built an entire company on instinct he'd never fully articulated to her, and it took almost losing that company to finally understand what that instinct had actually been protecting all along. And here's the ending most people don't expect, because it's not loud. Reese Auto and Machine still has 1 bay. The wood stove still groans through cold mornings the same way it always has. The folding table is still pushed against the parts shelf, though Junie's math has gotten harder, and she still narrates customers' problems out loud before Callum's even opened the hood, usually correctly. What's different is smaller than people expect. A framed photograph now hangs behind the register of a 7-year-old in oversized safety glasses standing next to an assembly line bracket. And underneath it, in Callum's own handwriting, 4 words that mean more to him than any patent ever did. Fixed it. Told them so. Vivienne Thorne still drives up to Harbor Mills sometimes, not always for business. And she still parks in the same gravel lot where she once stood in heels that weren't built for it, and said something she'd take back if she could. She never brought it up directly, and neither did Callum, because some corrections don't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. She just started showing up differently. Listening first. Looking twice at things before deciding what they were worth. Somewhere in that small cinder-block building, a man who once held 4 patents in a corner office chooses every single day to spend his afternoons where a folding table and a wood stove matter more to him than any title ever did. And somewhere in a boardroom 4 states away, a CEO who once laughed at the size of his garage now measures competence by something other than the size of the building it's housed in. So here's the actual lesson, and it's not the one you think. It's not, don't judge a book by its cover. Everyone already knows that one. And it's never once stopped anyone from doing exactly what Vivienne did in that gravel parking lot. The real lesson is this. The people who could save you are usually hiding in plain sight, in the places you've already decided aren't worth a second look. The $41 invoice. The 1-bay garage. The folding table nobody thought twice about. The only difference between a disaster and a recovery, most of the time, is whether somebody actually stopped long enough to ask the right question before it was too late. If this story reminded you that the smartest person in the room is sometimes the one nobody bothered to look at twice, leave a comment and let it be known. Share it with someone who's ever been underestimated for the size of their office instead of the size of their knowledge. Because sometimes the people quietly holding the whole structure together are the ones everybody else already walked past. And sometimes it takes watching everything almost fall apart to finally notice who'd been holding it up all along.